In the stillness of a quiet evening, Nora believed she was safe in the sanctuary of her own home. The exhaustion of a long day faded as she lay stretched out on her bed, wrapped in the comfort of solitude. But that fragile sense of peace shattered when her teenage nephew, Daniel, appeared at her doorway, casting an unsettling shadow over what should have been an ordinary night. What began as a simple encounter soon unraveled into a chilling and unexpected confrontation, one that would change everything Nora thought she knew about her world and the people within it. The air grew heavier with unspoken words. Glances lingered too long, and the lines of family and boundaries blurred in ways Nora couldn't have imagined. What was once a bond of trust became a haunting tale of emotions that neither could control nor ignore. As the story unfolds, you'll be gripped by the intensity of the choices they face and the unrelenting tension of a connection that defies the rules of family and reason. This is not just a story of one night but of the moments that test the limits of love, morality, and the human spirit. Prepare yourself for a tale that will leave you questioning where the line should be drawn and what happens when it's crossed. Up until tonight, Nora had always felt secure in her own home. It was her sanctuary, her fortress against the outside world. After a long day, she had settled into her nightly routine, locking the doors, turning off the lights, and retreating to the comfort of her room. The evening had begun like any other, but everything changed when her teenage nephew, Daniel, appeared at her doorway. The day's exhaustion clung to her like the humid night air. Nora stretched out on her bed, her bare skin pressing against the cool sheets, savoring the rare moment of peace in the quiet stillness of her home. The faint, golden glow of the setting sun filtered through her window, casting long shadows across the room. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension of the day melt away, her mind already drifting into a restful haze. But then, a faint creak broke the silence, a subtle sound, yet jarring in the otherwise tranquil house. Nora's eyes shot open, her senses on high alert. Turning her head toward the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, bathed in the dim light spilling from the hallway, was Daniel. "What are you doing up, Daniel?" she asked softly, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of surprise. He hesitated, shifting awkwardly, his gaze flickering to the side before returning to hers. "I couldn't sleep," he mumbled. "I just got up to grab some water." Nora furrowed her brow. Something about his tone, his posture, set her nerves on edge. "It's late," she replied gently. "You should go back to bed." Daniel didn't move. He stood there, his presence unsettling. His gaze lingered too long, and the unease in Nora's chest tightened. She instinctively pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders, a subconscious barrier between herself and the boy she'd known since he was a child. "I thought I heard something," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Nora's stomach knotted. "The doors are locked," she reassured herself as much as him, her voice quieter now, tinged with caution. "You don't need to worry. Just head back to bed." But Daniel didn't budge. Instead, he stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, his movements almost calculated. Nora's pulse quickened. "Daniel?" Her voice sharpened, a warning note creeping in. "What are you doing?" He stopped at the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Then his gaze dropped, briefly but unmistakably, to the exposed skin of her legs, where the blanket didn't quite cover. It was fleeting, but it was enough. Nora's heart hammered in her chest as a chill of realization coursed through her. Daniel had seen her, seen too much. The vulnerability of the moment hit her like a wave. A stark reminder of the thin line between familiarity and intrusion. "Daniel," she snapped, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a knife. "What are you doing?" He flinched, his face flushing with embarrassment. I didn't mean to," he stammered, his words tumbling over each other. "Out!" Nora barked, pointing toward the door, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Now! Go to your room." Daniel's eyes widened, his expression a mix of shame and confusion. Without another word, he turned and bolted from the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Nora sat frozen, her body trembling as she processed what had just happened. The oppressive silence of the house enveloped her, broken only by the erratic rhythm of her breathing. She replayed the scene in her mind, the creak of the floorboards, Daniel's lingering stare, the unsettling intimacy of the encounter. Something had shifted between them, something she couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. Minutes passed in a haze of confusion and unease. Then, a soft knock at the door made her jump. Her breath hitched as Daniel's muffled voice broke the stillness. "Aunt Nora," he called quietly. "Can I come in? I need to talk." "No," Nora replied firmly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Go to bed. Please." Daniel pleaded. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Nora hesitated, her mind racing. There was a desperation in his tone, a vulnerability that gave her pause. Against her better judgment, she sighed and rose from the bed, unlocking the door. As it creaked open, Daniel stepped inside, his posture tense, his eyes glued to the floor. "I didn't mean to," he began, his voice trailing off. "I wasn't trying to. It just happened." Nora's eyes narrowed, her arms crossing over her chest. "What exactly just happened, Daniel?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "You barged into my room in the middle of the night. Stared at me." "I wasn't staring," he interrupted, his voice rising defensively. "It wasn't like that. It felt like that." Nora shot back, her voice sharp. "You saw me, saw too much, and now you're standing here trying to explain it away." Daniel's face flushed a deeper red. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean to." But as he spoke, Nora caught a flicker of something in his expression, a fleeting look that made her stomach twist. It wasn't just guilt. There was something else. Something darker, lurking beneath the surface. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper now, her heart pounding in her chest. Daniel hesitated, his gaze finally meeting hers. "What I saw," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible. "It's hard to forget." Nora's breath caught, her mind reeling as the weight of his words settled over her. The room seemed to close in, the air thick with tension. For the first time, she felt truly unsafe in her own home. The silence between them thickened, an invisible fog of unsaid words, lingering guilt, and something far more insidious. It clung to the air like a shroud, suffocating and inescapable. Nora's chest felt tight as though the walls were slowly closing in. There was an unease she couldn't ignore, a creeping danger that sent cold tendrils of dread down her spine. "You need to go," she said at last, her voice low but unyielding. every syllable laced with tension. Now. Return to your room. We'll pretend this never happened. Daniel's eyes dropped to the floor. His expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if the words themselves might shatter him. I can't. Nora froze. Her pulse quickened, the words striking her like a sudden gust of icy wind. She turned to him, her gaze sharp and piercing. What did you just say? I can't stop thinking about it, Daniel murmured, almost to himself, his voice thick with turmoil. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers for something unspoken. About you. A sharp intake of breath escaped Nora's lips. Stop. Just stop. Her voice faltered, betraying the strength she desperately tried to summon. She turned away, her back to him, pacing toward the window with fists clenched at her sides. The suffocating weight of vulnerability pressed down on her, threatening to consume her entirely. This is wrong. This shouldn't have happened, she said, her words trembling yet resolute. Daniel moved closer, his footsteps deliberate, his presence an almost tangible force behind her. His voice dropped to a hushed tone, raw with emotion. I don't know why it feels like this, but it does. I can't just forget it. Nora. She spun around, her eyes blazing with confusion and anger, her emotions warring within her. It's not normal. You're my nephew, Daniel. This, whatever this is, should never have started. And it can't continue. Do you understand me? Daniel's expression darkened, his features etched with an intensity that sent a shiver down Nora's spine. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said, his voice rough with frustration. I didn't plan for it. I didn't even see it coming. Nora's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow as the walls seemed to close in around her. What are you hoping to gain from this? She whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her disbelief. What do you want from me? Daniel stepped closer, his eyes locked onto hers with a disconcerting focus. I don't know. I can't shake this feeling. It's there. And it's real. Nora. Whether you want to admit it or not. Real? Nora's voice broke, her composure unraveling as fear and anger twisted together in a chaotic storm. This isn't love, Daniel. It's not some romantic fantasy. It's wrong. And you know it. Daniel's jaw tightened, his face contorting with something between defiance and desperation. I didn't choose this, he said, his voice rising. I didn't ask for it. But it's there. And I don't know how to let it go. Nora's breath came in short, sharp bursts. She felt as though the ground beneath her feet was crumbling, leaving her teetering on the edge of an abyss. You have to stop this. You have to stop. This isn't a game. It's not just about you. Daniel's gaze burned with a primal intensity, a look so raw it made Nora's stomach churn. I don't think I can, he said softly, his tone almost gentle, but no less resolute. Her hands trembled as she backed away, the edge of the bed pressing against her legs. You don't have a choice, she said, her voice shaking but firm. You will stop this. Daniel took another step forward, his movements slow but deliberate, his presence overwhelming. I don't want to hurt you, he said quietly. But I can't pretend this isn't real. Get out. Nora said, her voice barely audible but charged with desperation. Get out before she could finish. Daniel cut her off. His voice steady and unwavering. "We're connected now. Nora. There's no undoing that." Her vision blurred. The room spinning as panic clawed its way to the surface. She felt trapped. Not just physically but emotionally. Unable to escape the suffocating weight of what had been said. "Connected?" she spat, shaking her head as if trying to rid herself of the word. "You're my nephew. Daniel. You don't get to rewrite reality just because you feel something you shouldn't." Daniel's gaze softened. But the intensity in his eyes never wavered. "I don't know what to do anymore," he admitted. His voice breaking. "But I can't pretend it doesn't exist." Nora sank onto the edge of the bed. Her body trembling as her mind raced to process his words. The room felt colder. The air heavier. She glanced at her phone on the nightstand. Its screen lit up with a new message from Robert. "Robert, hey. Hope you're doing okay. We need to talk soon. Call me when you can." Nora's fingers hovered over the phone. But she couldn't bring herself to respond. The weight of Daniel's confession loomed over her like a dark cloud, suffocating any sense of clarity she might have found. How had it come to this? How had the line between them blurred so irreparably? The questions swirled in her mind. But no answers came. Only the suffocating realization that her world had shifted, and there was no turning back. The memory of their interaction played in her mind like a relentless, broken record. Each detail searing itself deeper into her consciousness. Every glance. Every tremor in his hand. Every charged silence, it all felt so stark. So undeniable. The way he looked at her wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a mistake. It was real. It had happened. And there was no undoing it. The realization hit Nora like a tidal wave, dragging her into an ocean of doubt and fear. This wasn't a fleeting moment of confusion. Nor was it an accidental blip in the fabric of their lives. Daniel hadn't just stumbled into this feeling, he had been watching her. Observing her. Long before she had even begun to notice. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Cold and piercing. Her chest tightened as her mind unraveled a truth she had buried. Perhaps intentionally. This wasn't something she could shrug off as an unfortunate misstep. No, this was far more insidious. It wasn't a passing crush. A momentary lapse in judgment. It was something profound. Something perilous. Her pulse quickened. Her breaths shallow. As her thoughts spiraled uncontrollably. A flicker of movement in her periphery jolted her back to the present. Daniel was standing there. Framed by the doorway. His expression shadowed and unreadable. But there was a difference now. A subtle shift. His gaze wasn't just uncertain, it was calculated. Deliberate. Something about it made her stomach churn. "I shouldn't have come in here," Daniel muttered, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. Nora's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. The tension in the room was suffocating. "No," she said coldly, her tone sharp enough to cut through steel. "You shouldn't have. You shouldn't have said what you did. You shouldn't have. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." Daniel interrupted, his voice quick, almost pleading. "I didn't mean for any of this. I'm sorry. I can't control it." Nora's fists clenched in her lap, the knuckles whitening with the force of her grip. Her voice trembled. Not with fear but with barely restrained fury. "Daniel. This isn't about control. You've crossed a line you can't uncross. You've made me feel something I don't even have words for." He flinched. his shoulders sinking under the weight of her words. But Nora wasn't done. Her voice hardened, taking on an edge of disgust and disbelief. That's not an excuse. It's wrong. It's more than wrong. You're my family. My nephew. Daniel's face twisted with a mix of anguish and defiance, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I know what it looks like. I know how it sounds. But I can't help how I feel. I've tried. Her heart pounded in her chest as his words sank in, each one tightening the knot of dread in her stomach. This is disgusting, she hissed, her voice cracking. This is impossible. We can't just keep pretending this isn't happening. Daniel took a hesitant step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. His dark eyes bore into hers, unyielding and filled with something that made her skin crawl. But we can't pretend it isn't real either. Nora shot to her feet, her sudden movement startling him. Her eyes blazed with a mixture of fury and desperation. No, we have to pretend. We have to forget this, whatever this is. You need to walk away. Daniel. Forget what you think you feel. Forget me. He shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable but undeniably resolute. It's not that simple. Nora. Her voice rose, tinged with panic. It has to be that simple. This madness, you're going to destroy everything. I won't let it. I refuse to let it. Daniel's expression darkened, his voice dipping into something almost menacing. You can't stop it. You can't stop me. Not now. Nora's breath hitched as his words sank in, their weight suffocating. Her fists clenched tighter, nails digging into her palms. I'm your aunt. I raised you. Daniel. How could you let this happen? How could you let it get this far? Daniel's gaze sharpened, an unsettling glimmer sparking in his eyes. It wasn't just me, he said quietly, his tone laced with a bitterness that sent shivers down her spine. It was you too. The accusation hit Nora like a physical blow, her body recoiling as though struck. She staggered back, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with disbelief. No. Don't you dare. Don't you dare put this on me. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained locked on hers, unwavering. You know I'm right, he said softly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone. You felt it too. Maybe you didn't want to admit it, but you did. Nora shook her head furiously, her entire body trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far, Daniel added, his voice trailing off into the suffocating silence that followed. But the damage was done. His words hung in the air like a specter, a shadow that would haunt her forever. The tension between Nora and Daniel weighed down the room like an oppressive fog, smothering every sound, every movement, every breath. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty but brimming with unspoken words, thick with emotions too dangerous to be voiced. Nora's footsteps echoed against the cold floor as she paced back and forth, her hands clenching and unclenching, her mind racing in chaotic loops. She was desperate to make sense of it all, of what had just been said, of what had just unfolded between them. Her chest tightened with each shallow breath, her heart hammering like a drumbeat of panic. How had things spiraled so far out of her control? How had she allowed this to happen? How had she let him get this close? Closer than anyone should ever have been. Across the room, Daniel stood motionless, a shadow in the dim light, his gaze fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. He didn't speak. Didn't move. As if afraid that any action might shatter the fragile balance between them. His face was a mask. Unreadable. But Nora could see the storm brewing in his eyes, a raw, conflicted emotion he couldn't hide. It was as though he knew, deep down, that the line they had crossed could never be uncrossed. That the damage was irreparable. And yet, he didn't flinch. Nora's pacing came to an abrupt halt. Her body turned sharply. Her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and desperation as she faced him. When she spoke, her voice was cold. Each word cutting like shards of ice. "You can't keep doing this. Daniel. You just can't." Daniel's jaw tightened. But his gaze didn't waver. If anything, it grew steadier. More defiant. "It's not something I can just turn off." "Nora," he said. His voice low but firm. As if the truth he carried was too heavy to bear yet impossible to release. Her eyes narrowed. Her shoulders stiffening as anger surged through her. "It is not right for you to feel this way. This is inappropriate. Daniel. This is wrong." Her voice trembled slightly at the edges, betraying the vulnerability she so desperately tried to hide. Daniel's response was barely above a whisper. But it carried the weight of an unyielding confession. "My feelings remain the same." Tears burned at the corners of Nora's eyes as her chest heaved. The reality of his words crashing over her like a tidal wave. She pressed a trembling hand to her face, as though trying to shield herself from the truth. "This can't happen. There should be no relationship like this between us," she said, her voice breaking. "You're my family. Daniel. I raised you. How could you let yourself feel this way?" Daniel's lips thinned, his face darkening with a mixture of frustration and pain. "I didn't plan for it to happen," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "But it did. And now I can't ignore it anymore." Nora shook her head violently, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "You must ignore it. You have to stop this, stop these thoughts. These feelings. Do you have any idea what you're risking? This isn't just about us. This is about our family. Our lives. Everything we've built. It's all at stake now. Daniel. Don't you see that?" For a fleeting moment, Daniel's eyes softened. A flicker of vulnerability breaking through his hardened exterior. It was enough to make Nora falter. Her anger giving way to something more fragile, fear. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come. And his gaze grew resolute once more. "You're afraid," Daniel said quietly, his tone almost gentle. Nora's breath caught in her throat, and she shook her head, her movements frantic, her voice rising with a mix of anger and desperation. "Of course I'm afraid. I'm terrified. Daniel. This thing you're feeling, it's dangerous. It's wrong. And it's going to destroy us both if you don't let it go." Daniel's expression darkened further, his jaw clenching as he took a step closer. "I can't let it go. Nora," he said, his voice steady, deliberate. "Every time I see you, every time we're alone, I feel it. And it's not going away. I've tried to push it down, to bury it. But it's still there. It's always there." Nora felt the blood drain from her face as his words sank in. One by one. Each one like a knife twisting in her chest. Her mind screamed for a way out. An escape. But there was none. The walls of the room seemed to close in around her. the air growing thinner with each passing second. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely audible. "You're my nephew. Daniel. This can't happen. It can't. It has to stop." But Daniel only shook his head, his expression unyielding. "It's too late," he said, his voice dropping to a dark, quiet murmur. "I've already crossed a line I can't come back from. And I can't stop now." The finality in his words hit Nora like a physical blow, leaving her breathless. Her chest heaved, her vision blurred, her body trembling with a mix of fear and despair. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped, not just in the room but in the web of emotions and decisions that had brought them here. And deep down, she knew Daniel wouldn't stop. He couldn't. And she was powerless to change what had already begun. In the days that followed, an unspoken tension hung thick in the air between Nora and Daniel, like a dense, impenetrable fog that neither of them dared to acknowledge. Their interactions were sparse, reduced to curt exchanges of necessity, and every shared glance felt like a fleeting brush with an unseen flame. Despite their attempts to carry on as though nothing had changed, the undercurrent of unease refused to dissipate. It lingered, heavy and oppressive, dragging each moment into an agonizing slow-motion march toward the inevitable. Nora often found herself retreating into silence, sitting alone in the living room, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. It was her way of distracting herself from the growing turmoil within. One evening, as the shadows deepened and the house grew still, Daniel entered the room. His footsteps were soft, almost hesitant, as though he feared disturbing the fragile peace that hung by a thread. Nora didn't look up, but she felt his presence immediately, an inexplicable awareness of him that tightened her chest. Her fingers hovered over the screen, unmoving. Then, Daniel broke the silence, his voice quiet yet burdened with tension. "We need to talk," he said, the words falling into the room like stones into a still pond. She placed the phone on the coffee table with deliberate care, turning to face him. Her gaze was steady, but her arms folded defensively across her chest. "We've already talked enough, Daniel," she replied, her voice calm but edged with weariness. "No," Daniel said, stepping closer, his determination palpable. "We haven't said what actually needs to be said." Nora's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She had known this moment would come, had dreaded it with every fiber of her being. "What's left to say?" she asked, her voice strained. This shouldn't even be happening. It shouldn't be possible." Daniel stopped a few feet away, his eyes searching hers with quiet intensity. "It doesn't matter if it should or shouldn't," he said, his voice low but firm. "What matters is that it is happening. And we can't keep pretending it's not." Nora's lips pressed into a thin line, her fists clenching at her sides. "But we have to pretend," she shot back. "We have to ignore it, Daniel. For everyone's sake, our families, our peace, our lives." Daniel's expression softened, but his voice was tinged with anguish. "Ignoring it won't make it go away. It won't change the fact that it's real." Nora shook her head, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It can't be real. It shouldn't be real. We're not supposed to feel this, Daniel. It's wrong. But feelings don't follow rules," Daniel said gently, stepping closer. "Sometimes they break them. Sometimes they defy logic and reason. And maybe, just maybe, this isn't something we were meant to ignore. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Nora felt a lump rise in her throat, her breath catching as she struggled to hold his gaze. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth in his words, the undeniable pull between them. The way her heart seemed to beat differently when he was near. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We can't." Daniel's hand reached out slowly, brushing against hers. His touch sent a jolt through her, an electric current that ignited a spark she had tried so desperately to extinguish. "We already have," he said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. The contact was brief, but it was enough to shatter Nora's resolve. She pulled her hand away as though burned, stepping back to create distance. Her breathing quickened, and her voice was firm but tinged with desperation. "This isn't just about us anymore," she said. "It's bigger than that. If anyone finds out..." "No one will find out," Daniel interrupted, his voice steady but resolute. "I'll make sure of it. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you. To protect us." Nora's emotions churned within her. Fear and longing locked in a battle for dominance. "You don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "We can't control this anymore. It's too big. It's like a storm heading straight for us. And no matter what we do, we can't stop it." Daniel took another step forward, his tone softening. "Then let's face it together," he said. "Whatever comes, we can handle it." Nora's voice cracked as she replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not about what we can handle. It's about what's right. And this isn't right." Daniel's face fell, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "What if ignoring it destroys us anyway?" he asked, his voice laced with quiet despair. Nora's response was a whisper, filled with heartbreak. "Then we let it destroy us silently. We let it fade away like it never existed." Daniel's jaw tightened, his frustration and sadness evident. "You're asking me to forget something I can't. To pretend that something so real never happened." She looked away, her tears threatening to spill over. "We have no choice. This is the only way." Without another word, Nora turned and walked toward the door. Daniel remained frozen in place, watching her leave, the silence between them more deafening than any argument. As the door closed behind her, Daniel realized that this wasn't the end of their story. It was merely the beginning of a battle they would wage every day, against themselves, against their feelings, and against the unyielding reality of what they had become. Nora sat quietly in the stillness of her room, her eyes fixed on the window where the faint moonlight filtered through the trees. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories and emotions, each more chaotic than the last. Outside, the house was silent, but inside her heart, a relentless battle waged on. Daniel was gone, yet his presence lingered like a shadow, not of hatred or anger, but of unanswered questions. How had things gone so far? How had a relationship that was once her safe haven become so distorted and dark? She knew that distance was the only way for both of them to heal. Nora had to protect not only herself but also Daniel from the inevitable consequences of their actions. The hardest decision wasn't ending what had transpired, it was learning to move forward, to confront herself, and to rebuild the values she once held dear. Daniel had left her a message after he departed. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I'll go away so we both have time to heal. Take care of yourself. Aunt Nora. Reading his words, Nora felt a bittersweet sense of relief. She knew this was the right thing to do. Sometimes, love, or whatever intense emotion it may be, has to be let go for the wounds to mend. She lifted her head, took a deep breath, and resolved to move on. Every person in our lives is a lesson. And this one reminded her that boundaries must be upheld, even when the heart resists. This story serves as a powerful reminder that emotions, no matter how intense, must exist within the framework of ethics and responsibility. When boundaries are crossed, the repercussions can be profound, not just for ourselves but for everyone around us. If you ever find yourself facing a similar internal conflict, reach out for support from loved ones, friends, or a professional counselor. Do not let fleeting emotions lead you down an irreversible path. Remember, loving and protecting yourself is also a way of preserving the goodness in your life. Thank you for staying with us through this deeply emotional story. If this narrative has given you something to reflect on, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our future videos. Wishing you peace and light in your life.